Hi, everyone. My name is Spencer White, and today I have the privilege of presenting Chapter 12 of Lippy Green's textbook that we've been looking at this semester. The chapter is titled Defying Paradise, Hawaii. So, in the beginning of this chapter, our attention as an audience is brought to the duality between mainstream media's image of Hawaii and then the stark contrastive social problems that are lasting in Hawaii because of colonialism. So often, as sort of Lippy Green talks about, we we learn about aloha and this culture of flowers and beautiful, pristine beaches. But what we're not realizing is that there are some really big social problems that are happening because of colonialism. And there are a lot of these which are affecting language and which are caused by language um, diversity and linguistic challenges that have come up. So Hawaii is a very diverse place, racially and ethnically. Um, and in the chapter, you can read at the beginning of the first section a lot of different local accounts which talk about um, how people perceive the islands now that people have come to the island, now that it's a state as part of the United States. They've talked about nicknames that are given to different racial groups. It's a very rapidly changing place, and this comes with its own set of challenges, as much as it may be a positive thing in other regards, like economically, as it says. Um, and then I guess the whole underscore of this chapter, which we're introduced to here, is that there's a web of relationships that is seen between language and authority, privilege, economic privilege, social privilege, and minority languages, and the way that people speak, the patterns of speech among existing populations that might have already been there before the legacy of colonialism. Before I move on, I do want to bring our attention. Haloe is a vocabulary word which is underlined, which might help your understanding of the chapter, which hopefully you've read, means pale skin color, or that maybe somebody who would identify with this term would be from outside of the island originally. The first section of this chapter, past the introduction, is called Hawaiians Talk. It kind of introduces us to the speech of Hawaiians. It's worth noting, and it is noted, that before colonialism, before it was recognized as a state, and even before that, before Western powers sort of got a hold of the island, people who were in the group of islands, Hawaii, spoke with Polynesian languages. The whole set of languages was called Olelo Hawaii. Um, this was the language which was really a group of, it says, three or four different languages that was sort of come to be known as Hawaii, Aloha, um, Hawaii. So because of that, as we know, when the 20th century came on early on, Lippy Green says that globalizing powers came together and the world became more interconnected, as we know. And because of this, it kind of developed this Hawaiian pidgin, which we've talked a little bit about in previous chapters, but we're given an explicit definition here, which is a pidgin is a language which is cobbled together from three or four different languages. So it might use the structures and the vocabulary from one language and maybe the vocabulary from one, and it weaves them together, and that's known as a pidgin. Interestingly, if a pidgin is passed on to a new speaker, somebody who maybe is born into a family where the pidgin language is only spoken, it's become known as a Creole. So a Creole is a pidgin, which is this intersection of multiple languages, but it's can acquire native speakers, and at that point, it's called a Creole. So Hawaiian Creole is what's talked about in this chapter, and that's what's spoken today in modern day Hawaii. And it's a uses English structure primarily, but it combines the Polynesian languages that were there already, uses vocabulary from multiple languages. It talks about Japanese, Filipino languages, even some Chinese, it says, and it's healthily known at least a little bit to some extent by over 600,000 people today in Hawaii. I did want to I photocopied this chart here because I really think that it underscores a lot of the points that are made here about the diversity and about the globalization that's taken place in Hawaii. This graph talks about foreign born residents of Hawaii, which are presently living in Hawaii, which it does show a super majority within one population, but I think that it highlights that there are a lot of different populations there. And you can see by the numbers that even though this is only showing the foreign born residents, you can see by the numbers alone that all of these people come together to make up a very large amount of people, 212,000 people total, making up this really um, intercultural international base, which contributes to the larger population of Hawaii. So this it's a very diverse place, but speaking pidgin can lead to discriminatory practices within some of these groups. There's accounts that have been noted in here that different people have experienced discrimination from speaking privilege in this way, speaking in pidgin. One account says even that you could lose a job would be an explicit example. Somebody said that you would never speak that way in an interview. You would never speak with pidgin, even though it's so diverse. You would never use this diverse language, despite the fact that you could argue that it represents and mirrors the population diversity. You would never use it in an interview or any sort of professional capacity because there's this stigma. So sort of interesting. I think that figure really adds to this conversation. This is the section where we really get into the meat of this conversation about language subordination, which we've been talking about, which Hawaii makes for a really interesting example. So in 1987, the Hawaii Board of Education declared that uh, English, standard English, as they say, uh, however you define that, they say that standard English is now the mode of communication for all students and all staff in the state of Hawaii, which this effectively barred the use of Hawaiian Creole in schools. Um, so what this means a few things. Pidgin English from this point, which was a very major historical point in the history of using this speech pattern in Hawaii, uh, it was effectively seen as inciting illiteracy. It was seen as being used by lazy people, by people who might not be able to speak using standard English, as if standard English was this superior way of speaking for the educated, for the well off. And it's worth noting, as is noted by Lippy Green, that this disproportionately affects lower class populations. There's a number in here that I thought was interesting. There was a study, and when this passed, this Hawaii board declares this 26% of private school students felt that Hawaiian Creole should be allowed in school, but 54% of public school students supported its use. So that sort of demonstrates this disparity between classes. So I think that's really interesting, and really underlines this point that's being made. Um, I also want to just say this, language standardization policies exclude, quote, languages linked to social differences, and it is this which makes us uncomfortable. Um, this whole language subordination cloak is passed over um, this idea that differences are harmful and that minority groups don't need to have a voice. It's a very harmful ideology and rhetoric, but this is what's giving chase to these sort of policies and these legislative actions that are contributing to this subordination, which we've talked about before, but a very explicit example. The last little section of this is called Talk Story. Without Pigeon, I Would Cease to Be Whole, is the title of the section. talk story, as it says, is referred to a cultural activity, but it's both a noun and it's a verb. So if you're engaging in the activity of talk story, it means that you're sort of you're engaging in really rich conversation. So we might say, um, let's dish. Some of the some young people might say, let's dish, or um, yeah, like let's sit down and have a really good conversation, a deep conversation, a meaningful conversation. This is talk story. Um, this exists both in an activity where you engage in conversation, but also in writing. So there's some media sources where we'll have like a talk story column in newspapers, which is what's talked about in this section specifically. Something that I was thinking about when I read this, which might be helpful, is thinking about nowadays you might see like real talk columns or sections of TV programs like The View or talk shows like that might have like a real talk um, little session on there or column. This sort of reminded me a lot of that. So do with that as you will. Um, the whole reason why this is brought up is because of this bombshell article report that was passed through ABC's news cycles on July 3rd of 1983. And effectively, in the title of this and in the content of this report, they say that pigeon language is a fad. Um, so, of course, this is like a whole thing that needs to be dissected, and it is dissected. So first of all, this whole report explicitly it makes it very clear that language subordination is at play here. Absolutely says that there's a level of superiority among non-pigeon language users, and ultimately what this implies by calling it a fad, and this was noticed by the general public, is that pigeon is not a sustainable or any sort of substantial way of communicating. It won't last longer than any longer than some cheap fashion accessory is a fad or something like that. It's a very disingenuous and ultimately harmful way of talking about speech of when so many people in this area spoke it. So this was a really big deal, and this report was talked about. The other thing that this report did, it was blatantly a mockery, as it was said by some people. It suggests that pigeon users were only using it for trivial natures or to be funny. It was never of any substantial sort. You can never use pigeon, quote unquote, to say anything meaningful or anything intellectual, which again employs this late language subordination. And then the last part of this, and I wanted to read out of this book here for this. It showed in the report people who were speaking, like in putting this claim of theirs forward that pigeon is a fad. They showed people who speak it, but the only people that they showed were young, the unemployed, the overwrought, emotive, fun-seeking beach boys, teenagers, people who believe they have no purpose in life. So again, this report has sort of unfairly portrayed pigeon, and it's reinforcing this language subordination. So this as it talks about in this chapter, this report still receives letters to the editor today about how this was wrong. Um, and it does go on to say that there's been a lot of progress made in the area of noticing and also improving language subordination efforts, like this report sort of gave chase to. So there is a bit of light to be seen here. Um, Hawaiian Creole speakers have begun to assert themselves in modern day, engaging in this conversation, being language activists for their way of speech. But there are still scholars, specifically the one at University of Hawaii that was mentioned, Marlene Booth is her name, that still suggests that there's a blatant problems with subordination and assimilation that surround Hawaiian Creole today in Hawaii. I wanted to just submit my personal reflection just for 1 second. I think that so often when we talk about linguistic discrimination and subordination, as we have in this class, specifically surrounding Pidgin and Creole languages. um, we think about it in some sort of exotic frame. We think about other societies, and we sort of have this filter between ourselves and as Westerners, as people in the United States, and people who actually speak like this. And it's easy for us to distance ourselves and to not really relate. But I think what's so valuable about this chapter is that we actually are seeing evidence of these things happening, Pidgin and Creole uh, being seen as inferior and being discriminated against in our own country. Hawaii is part of the United States, and I think that that makes this really interesting. So that was just something that I personally found engaging, and I hope that maybe that puts something into perspective for you as well. And then lastly, I would just say that the Columbus State University Trombone Choir this past May actually performed in Hawaii at the University of Hawaii. We were there for a week, and I just loved my time. And one of the things that I enjoyed so much was learning about the legacies of Hawaiian populations and their language. It's such a beautiful place, not only geographically and under the guise of this tourism sector, but also it's such a rich culture that I have such a deep appreciation for personally because of my own experiences there. So I was really glad that I got assigned this chapter as well. Um, I have two discussion questions for everybody. I'll read them here and I'll let you think about them on your own, and I look forward to seeing your answers. The first question is, what difficulties might arise for speakers of Pidgin or Creole in Hawaii uh, experience as tourism rates begin to surge after COVID-19 pandemic? What can be done to solve these challenges? Second question I have is, who benefits most when Hawaiian Creole is barred from schools, and what difficulties might arise for language advocates who try to preserve this language after such actions are taken? So I look forward to seeing your answers of those. Before I let it go, I did want to just mention, not that I have any sort of authority or that I'm any expert in any way, but I did know that Duolingo has a Hawaiian language program that you can do for free if you're interested. And if you're really interested, and you probably would already know this if you were, but the University of Hawaii has a really good linguistics department, and you can study the Hawaiian language. And I think they do summer programs and immersion programs as well. So if you're interested, maybe that's worth looking into. But otherwise, I really appreciate you taking the time. Um, Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing your answers to my discussion questions. Thank you.